Jai Baba, everyone. Sorry I can't be with you tonight in my too solid flesh, as Shakespeare says. I'm recovering at Baba's pace. He told us all in San Francisco in 1956 to have 1% of his infinite patience. So as a patient, I have to have patience. And you too, with me. Tonight, our subject is one of the world's most famous men, Jesus, or as his name was pronounced then, Joshua of Nazareth. He has influenced Western history and culture of the last 2,000 years, perhaps more than any other man. And rightfully so. He was the God-man. He was God in human form. Today's date is March 5th, 1983. And when we say 1983, we celebrate Jesus' birth as being 1,983 years ago. Our calendar begins with his birth date. Scholars say his real birth date was actually 7 A.D., so our correct date today would be March 5th. March 5th, 1976. Many people, including scholars, have questioned whether there was an actual historical Jesus. He was mentioned only once or twice in recorded archives, notably by Josephus, as being another young Jewish rabbi crucified for his unorthodox teachings. By the Jews of his time, he was considered the long-awaited Messiah. This was not the idea of an incarnation of God, but of a spiritually illumined prophet who would lead the Jews to freedom. To some Jews, this meant political freedom from the tyranny of the Romans. The idea that Jesus was an actual incarnation of God was developed by St. Paul. Jesus himself may have hinted at his divinity to the close disciples, but he called himself the Son of Man. His hints that he was one with his Father, and that none could come to the Father but through him, upset the very Orthodox Jews of his time. Because St. Paul spread the good news, or gospel, of the advent of the Messiah to a non-Semitic world, a Greek-educated world, he emphasized his divinity in terms they could understand. For example, the virgin birth. All Greek gods were born of a virgin. So for credibility, there is the charming myth of Christ's virgin birth. But Baba explains the birth of the avatar is always that of a normal human being. He is conceived in pure love, not lust. It is the 5 perfect masters, or Sadgurus of the age, that bring down God into human form, putting a veil over his divine consciousness so that he has a normal childhood. Then, at a special moment, one of the 5 breaks the veil by some physical contact. In the case of Jesus, it was his baptism by St. John, one of the 5 perfect ones of the age. There, at 29 years old, Joshua realized who he really was. Afterwards came some period of preparation by one of the perfect ones to bring the God-man to balanced knowledge of the illusory creation. In Jesus' life, this is the 40 days in the wilderness. Perhaps it was an actual 40 days, perhaps more. In Baba's life, it was the 7 years' work with Upasni Maharaj. The figure of 40 could also symbolize the 4th plane, where the avatar Jesus took his seat, and which colored his mission as one of the miracles, or 4th plane powers, like raising the dead, healing the sick, giving sight to the blind. Each time the avatar comes, he chooses one of the 7 spiritual planes from which to manifest. Baba said Buddha manifested from the 5th plane and Mohammed from the 6th plane. He said he'd tell us where he, Baba, was stationed when he comes again in 700 years. The ministry of Christ was for a very short time only. It is calculated to be no more than 2 years, perhaps only 1 year. The turbulent times he lived in, the violence and political suppression of the Jews, their fevered expectation of deliverance through the Messiah, all created a background of very swift dramatic events. The Avatar's timing, as Baba says, and as you quickly find out when you are around him, is perfect. In his life as Jesus, the timing of each of his moves, including the miracles, was perfect for his goal. Even his crucifixion was, in a way, perfectly timed. For example, Baba said the miracles of Jesus were done to bring about his crucifixion. If you study the New Testament, you will see this is so. It is the miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead, the most dramatic of all, that aroused the enmity of the Jewish priesthood or Sanhedrin. It brought about his capture. The miracle was done only a short time before his betrayal. But there is a big gap in our knowledge of Jesus' life that no scholarship has yet uncovered. His childhood is known up to the time when he is first taken up to Jerusalem, to the temple, and amazes the scholars there with his spiritual knowledge. From there on, there is a blank page, till at the age of 29 or 30, he sought out St. John in the wilderness. Where was he? What was he doing? Was he just a carpenter in his father Joseph's shop? Was he married? Did he study to be a rabbi? He was always called rabbi in later years. This necessitates study of the scriptures with his elders. Was he a member of the Essenes, a mystical sect of Jesus, which lived a very strict religious life, especially in caves in the desert? Baba said he would explain much about the life of Jesus in his yet undiscovered book. But he threw out a few hints. In visiting Benares, the holy city of India, Baba said he had been there as Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, and now Baba. Did Jesus travel to India during the unknown years? There are esoteric traditions that he did, also that he contacted the Essenes. Remember, there were 5 perfect masters living at the time. We know only one, St. John the Baptist. It's a rational guess that Jesus had contact with one or more of the other 4. Perhaps one or more were connected with the Essenes. Perhaps the others were located in Persia, Afghanistan, Rishikesh, or Benares in India. The perfect ones have always been located in these areas, just as they are today. Baba contacted all 5 of the perfect ones who brought him down into incarnation: Hazrat Baba Jan, Tajuddin Baba, Apasni Maharaj, Sai Baba, and Narayan Maharaj. At least we know Jesus must have met the hierarchy on inner plane meetings. There is some hint of that in the New Testament when the disciples saw him with Elijah and Moses at his side. The most striking thing about the life of Jesus is its end, the crucifixion, just as the most striking thing about Baba was his silence, or the renunciation was for Buddha under the bo tree. The classic New Testament story begins with Jesus' betrayal by Judas. But Baba told us in Myrtle Beach in 1952 that Judas had the hardest job of all to do, to obey Christ's order to betray him, and that he obtained realization like the rest. If you read the Gospels, you'll see that Jesus tells Judas at the Last Supper, "Go thou and do what thou must do quickly." It always used to interest me that though this was reported by other disciples, it was never considered as an order from the Master. Baba tells us all 12 of his inner circle received realization. So this must have included Judas, who acted, so to speak, under a veil. In fact, some scholars question if he really did commit suicide. but only rushed out to the desolate area, which was called in those times the field of suicide. In every way, both by its timing and its point-counterpoint action, it is clear the crucifixion was planned by the Avatar as the culminating act of his life as Jesus. Baba says we suffer for our karma. Saints sometimes suffer for the karma of others, but the God-man suffers for all humanity. The Avatar Ram suffered 14 years of persecution and exile. Zoroaster was persecuted and killed. Buddha was mocked by his fellow teachers and attacked by a group led by his cousin. Muhammad was forced out of Mecca and persecuted by his own family clan. These are visible physical sufferings, but the mental and spiritual suffering of the Avatar is constant and intense, and only sustained by his infinite bliss. In the life of Christ, his suffering was the ultimate crucifixion and death. Baba, sitting in that very chair you see now in our center, said in 1956, placing his 2 index fingers in a cross, "I am the Christ, undoubtedly," and added that only his infinite bliss sustained him in his suffering. Baba revealed to his disciples, as Elizabeth Patterson records in her diary, that the body of Jesus was taken to India and buried on a hilltop near Rishikesh. It was supposedly taken to India by St. Bartholomew and St. Thomas. The legend that St. Thomas visited Goa in India and made early Christian converts there is well established. There is even more direct legendary tales of Christ coming to India alive but very ill after the crucifixion and being buried near Rishikesh. Several books and a recent film go into the evidence. Tourists are even shown a tomb of Jesus near Rishikesh, but it is not where Baba pointed to when Elizabeth was there. In my archives, I have diaries that cover the day-to-day activities of the Ashram of Baba during 1926, 27, 28. One morning, Baba gave a very remarkable discourse, stating he did not die on the cross, but lived and went to India. I have asked Mayurji, who was a teacher in the ashram at that time, to authenticate this fact, and he did so on tape. This astounding fact, if true, would shake Christianity to its foundations, as the death and resurrection of Christ is the cornerstone of its faith. But a very fine researcher into the life of Jesus, Dr. Schoenfeld, who spent his whole life on the subject, came to the same conclusion and wrote it up in his book, The Passover Plot. Without any knowledge or belief in the divinity or even the fourth plane powers of the man Jesus, he concludes that Jesus timed his capture and crucifixion exactly so that he might survive it bodily. He was crucified on a Friday, beginning around 2 p.m., and therefore his body would have to be taken down before nightfall in order not to violate the Sabbath Eve. Therefore, he would be on the cross only a few hours, instead of the usual agony of several days. Dr. Schoenfeld's theory is Jesus planned to revive, and by his resurrection so startle the Jews that he would be able to lead them to freedom, political freedom, of course, but that Jesus' frail body revived and then collapsed. He goes into the details of his burial and so on to prove it. It is his explanation of the disappearance of the actual body, the empty tomb, and the grave cloth lying there. After his death, Jesus appeared to his disciples over 30 times in such a solid fashion that he ate with them at Emmaus and let St. Thomas, the doubter, probe his wounds. Of course, knowing the powers of the Avatar, or even other perfect masters, the resurrection or recovery of a severely wounded body or even a medically dead body is not beyond possibility. and the estimated 3 hours on the cross might not have been fatal. Ordinary yogis have done similar incredible feats, surviving without food, water, or oxygen underground for many months. Hazrat Babajan was buried alive and appeared later in Pune, hale and hearty. Apasni Maharaj lived in a cave without food or water for over a year, a medical miracle. But if we believe beloved Baba did survive his crucifixion, why did he do it? Obviously, it was a willed act of the God-man. Dr. Schoenfeld's idea is correct that the drama of the resurrection was a planned act to attract attention and secure a following, but not, as he thought, a political following. It was an act that emphasized one spiritual fact, the survival of bodily death. These were pagan times. The old gods were on the wane. Greco-Roman ideas of death were very vague in those days, and in the Jewish tradition there was, as today, very little emphasis on any real life after death. The plain facts of continuous birth and death, of continuous incarnation in a human form, was not current in the Mideast. Christ did not teach reincarnation openly, but he taught at least one part of it, the survival of death, by his very dramatic appearance after his own death, real or apparent. In ages to come, this incredible event revolutionized man's thinking about life after death. It also was of great support in the immediate future of his followers, many of whom had to suffer persecution and death at the hands of their enemies. It's easier to die if you think you will be reunited at once with your beloved master. Baba said his body was carried to India by his disciples. When I first heard this, long ago, I asked myself, how could this be done? Carry a corpse on a long, slow journey through hot desert country. But a severely wounded man could be carried that far, perhaps in a litter, as was usual in those days. The legends in Kashmir, especially those of a manuscript kept in an ancient Buddhist temple there, speak of the severely wounded man Jesus as being brought there by his disciples and recovering to live and teach and heal in India. Was it then, after his crucifixion, that Baba as Jesus traveled to Benares and stood on its banks, or was he there as a young boy? We must wait for 700 years, or until the famous book appears, to know the answer. Actually, though it may shake up Christians, it matters little. The real message of Christ was love, that God is love, and love is so, he has not ordained death for any man until our real final death in him at the moment of God realization. In the 30s, Baba told Jean Adriel, who asked him about it, that the famous Shroud of Turin was real, that it was the grave cloth of Christ. It has been studied by scientists and in some ways already authenticated by its material, its weave, and by the special ancient pollens on it, and so on. The marks of the wounds are in the exact places spoken of in the Bible. It has not been carbon dated yet. That would be the final touch. But what is so mysterious is that the image on the cloth is not painted on or dyed. It is, in some inexplicable way, burned into the cloth as if by some unknown radiant energy or force. It could be the willed act of the Avatar to use his incredible powers of the fourth plane to resurrect his own body, and that this burst of energy left a lasting impression on the cloth. It was a cloth that merely covered the body back and front. It was not the winding cloth, usually strips, used to bind a corpse. That is an interesting fact, too. The actual body of Christ was never found anywhere in Judea. According to Baba, It is buried on a hilltop in Rishikesh, India. This fact does not dim in any way the tremendous sacrifice of Jesus in going to Golgotha, in suffering on the cross for the sins of mankind. He is, as always, Redeemer and Savior and the spiritual leader of mankind. Yes, well, that's what I thought even before I had these archives, and it's amazing. I was just reading through them one day, it was an immense amount of material, and I just got this real startled fact coming out. And then when I heard of Mayerji coming, I did ask him, because he's the only person who was an adult at that time. Alaba was a student, the boy in the ashram, but nobody else was still alive from the ashram days. Now, especially Pendu's gone. What I was going to say is, maybe this borders a little bit on the occult side, but I do have real strong memories of that time. I know that I must have been alive at the time of Jesus, and many, many of the Baba people today, I feel, were there, and they seem to have that feeling. I remember we had a wonderful cook that cooked for Elizabeth and Narina, Anna Till, and she had very clear memories of being in the audience when Jesus gave his talk on the mountain, the Sermon on the Mount. And she had such a strong devotion to Jesus, and she never could quite see Baba as the return of Jesus. If you're a real devout Christian, it's probably maybe a little difficult, no matter how you revere Baba. And she had this wonderful dream. 3 times she had this dream. She's in the audience watching Jesus give his talk, and then Baba walks up the hill toward Jesus, and then they blend together and become one. And then she'd wake up, and she had this dream 3 times so impressively, and it just made all the difference to her, that she could feel that Baba was this real, exact return of Jesus. It's a very difficult point for perhaps some Christians to see that Baba is that same God-man come again. Maybe it's difficult for maybe it will be difficult for the Jews or the Mohammedans, because they have very particular ideas about the Messiah or the return of Muhammad. It doesn't seem so difficult for Hindus who know that Krishna does say, when the wick of righteousness burns low, I come again to be the savior of mankind. And also the Buddha said, I will come again, and my name will mean compassion. Now, Meher Baba, that's exactly what it means. Compassionate Father. And even Baba, as a small boy, the one thing, he did have a flash that he was Buddha. So even under this veil of sanskaras, yoga sanskaras that the 5 perfect ones put over the avatar, he did have a flash. And of course there are legends about the childhood of Jesus, but we don't really know what went on. But there has been this esoteric tradition of his traveling to India and through Egypt too, in some books, to learn the wisdom of the East. But as little as I do say about my memories, I just want to describe how Baba looked, how Jesus looked. And I'm looking now at this beautiful picture that shows Baba in his young years. And in fact, if I recall correctly, I don't know whether it was Margaret or one of those women who were with Baba, they did ask him, how did Jesus look? And he said that he looked very much like Baba did in his younger years, like I am now, Baba said. And of course they knew him in his 30s. And this picture, especially the one over my couch here, is so much like Jesus. I mean, you could hardly imagine that you wouldn't see Jesus as that. He had a reddish hair, and this has been authenticated in that one mention of him in Josephus, the Jewish historian, that he had red hair and very, very white skin and sort of a gray-blue eye. And he had a very strong profile like Baba has. And he was thin and very wiry like Baba. And when I first saw Baba walking, with this long stride. If you could see how Baba walks so beautifully in the early movies. You know, they say it's a peculiar thing that the stride, the walk of a person is very, very individual. In fact, police say that they can recognize. You can't disguise your walk. This is a very characteristic thing. And when I saw Baba walk, I just felt that was the walk of Jesus. It's very hard, you know, like a memory clicking in your head. And certain moments when I looked at Baba, it was just so clear. You know, it's the same with people, too, that they look like their past lives, you see. And Baba does, certainly in his earlier days. Baba was Jewish-looking, yes. He was Persian in this life and Jewish in that life. And not the Nordic blonde, you see, that people have painted him. And actually they say that the Nazarenes in this small village of Nazareth, the Jewish people there, they're all interrelated. They do, even today, have that peculiar fair skin, light eyes, and red hair. And an interesting thing in these legends about Baba in Kashmir, that there are many Jewish names there, and a group of people that have similar looks, that is fair, red-headed, Semitic-looking people. Well, they go on and on, but for what it's worth. But it is interesting just to feel that presence of Jesus in Baba, especially like the moment I do remember here in Hollywood. I was sitting right next to Baba in that chair, and he said, "I am the Christ, undoubtedly." And I guess it was Erich's voice that you hear, but it's like Baba's voice saying, yes. And of course in that vision that I had in the temple of Ramakrishna, which I've written up, where I saw this man come out on the platform, and the voice of Ramakrishna off to the side saying, "He is your Jesus." And then I saw this man with the reddish long hair and the very dynamic gestures and eyes looking like Jesus, but also later, when I discovered Baba looking exactly like Baba in his younger days. It was a very dynamic experience, and I heard him, this vision of Baba as Jesus, I heard him in the original Aramaic saying the first lines of the Sermon on the Mount. And I thought that was amazing. So I had, just by Baba's grace maybe, but I did feel also it was somehow a memory. And that's what Baba's saying, that if we're devoted to him, we have links with him, we are drawn back to him when he comes again. And I think that's grace, because out of this mass of seething humanity, you know, how much chance do you get to be with the avatar? It is that link coming from many, many lives of contact, and even casual contact. You think of all those Bible stories of people who passed him on the road, or gave him a drink of water, or who knows what. That brings them back to Baba's presence again when he comes again. I remember Don Stevens saying, and this was a new fact for all of us, he remembered it, that Baba said when he's the avatar in the body, he decides then who shall meet him in his next avatar appearance. So if we met him now as Baba, then Baba had decided that when he was Muhammad. And when he was Baba, then he's decided already who's going to meet him when he is whatever he is going to be next time. So he's like planning these intimate contacts on a basis way ahead in the future. And I'm sure that all of us are now in this room worshiping Baba, thinking of Baba. That's a link that will bring us back to him at this very important time when he comes again. And I'm sure that he'll be born in the Middle East. I think it's just the way the avatar always is. I don't feel that he'll be born in the West. So wherever it will be, and whatever the new map will be there. Because, as Bob explained, why The masters are there, the saints are there, the Muz Jews, all these interesting advanced souls, because the earth there is linked closely with the own point of creation. And to understand that more, you should read God Speaks. That's a plug now for reading God Speaks. And the life of the Avatar. It's just like a place where, like a mine, where all the jewels are. You know, it's just one place on earth where the jewels are. And you can't argue about it. You have to travel to where the jewels are. And so probably Baba's birth will be there again. An interesting thing about the star that was seen, you know, the legend of the star, many people have wondered about that. The astrologers figure out that it probably was a very special configuration that they understood that meant that Jesus, the Avatar, was born. And not that it was some particular bright nova. Other scientists say it's very possible that one of those novas explodes for a short time. They're millions of miles away, but it makes a very bright light. Another occult explanation is that it's something you see inwardly. You see the aura of the child, the Christ child, of the Avatar, this brilliant, brilliant light. You see, so some favored people saw that. And again, about the time of his birth, he really wasn't born supposedly at Christmas at all. He was born probably right now in March. Because in Judea, it's very cold in the winter and they don't keep the sheep out on the hills like that. So it would be springtime. It would be spring. And that would mean that all these things, you know, were just esoteric things, but like Baba was born in February, and Christ was born in March, you see. And Buddha was born in May. So it's like it's going backwards, which is the idea of the equinox going backwards in cycles. So the next time Baba was born, he might be born in January, going back. The reason why it's celebrated on Christmas is that a pagan holiday for God knows how long, thousands of years, was celebrated when the sun, the equinox, the solar equinox, on December 23rd, you know, light starts to come again. The days get longer again. And it was celebrated all over by ancient races, the equinox. And so it was a very big pagan holiday. And when people became Christians and they still had their very, very favorite pagan holidays, they just threw them all together. So that the birth of Christ is in December, really around the equinox. And a lot of the customs of Christmas are really pagan customs. For instance, the Christmas tree is a pagan custom. The worship of the tree is a holy thing, and they cut down the tree. And it got tied up with the idea of Christ. You see, a lot of those things are well known. But it's interesting because they become beautiful legends anyway. You know? I mean, what would we do without Christmas? It's wonderful. And as long as we celebrate God's birth. And so they would talk about Christ, and Mani would say, "Oh yes, my brother's Christ." And they'd all look at her, you know, like she's just, "What is this? Your brother is Christ?" I thought that's so amusing. And she said, yes, she, of course. It's interesting that she was so young that she was always growing up with Baba, already realized, as the Avatar. And there's this charming story of Baba coming into their place where they were playing, she and her girlfriend, and he climbed up a ladder there, and Mani describes it. He says to her, "Well, I'm in a good mood. I'll grant any wish you want. Make a wish, make a wish," he said to the two little girls. And one little girl, her playmate, said, "Oh, I want to grow up and have a beautiful wedding and marry a very rich, handsome young man and have a big wedding." And Baba said, that's... And then he looked at Mani and she said, "Oh, I want to live with you. I want to come and live with you when I grow up." So, of course, we know that she grew up and did live with Baba. And this girlfriend did grow up and did marry a very handsome, rich young man, and there was a giant, beautiful wedding. Mani was there as a guest. But the girl like this fairy tale, hadn't asked all the right questions, and the man passed away after a year of marriage. See, she got her wish, but it was not a complete. That's having Christ for a brother. Fantastic experience. Well, they used to call him the Man of Sorrows. I don't know whether that name was actually given to him at his time of his life, but I remember reading so much literature. I always thought he must have had a wonderful sense of humor. And of course, when I met Baba, I thought, well, of course there's Baba with all his charm and his gaiety, his love of humor. I wonder if really, that part hasn't been recorded in the New Testament. I mean, the whole thing of the tragic end of his life must have kind of overshadowed the stories when they put them down and told them, and they probably just, I think that he did. I think it just probably didn't get put down. No, I think probably he did at times. But as I said, the ministry of Jesus was very, very quick, very rapid. And that also amazed me. You see, the story of how those first disciples suddenly accept him. He calls them, he calls Peter, he calls them, and they just give up everything and come. There's no lingering, those 12 men just, because they had to. You see, he had only a short time to be with them. They didn't have years of training like Baba's men now. Adi was with him, 55 years, and Hendu and Ghani, all those long years of association with him. And they had to obey. They had to just be right there, from their life as it was before, right to the obedience and following of him. And they must have been very dazzled and puzzled at times, But they just didn't have time to learn a great many things and very mysterious hints that were given, because, as Bob explained, the avatar can only give that much of his teaching to the people of the time that they're able to absorb. And when you study the Jewish culture of that time, which people have done over and over again, first of all, they didn't have the theory of an avatar. They didn't have a theory of reincarnation, life after death, masters. It was all just very not in their way. So he couldn't really give lengthy explanations and esoteric things to his disciples. They just had to obey, they had to accept, they had to have faith. And Christianity is still like that. You really don't, you just accept, you accept Jesus and you're saved. It's not like you're going to go through a whole lot of understanding and explaining, and, it's still like that because it started like that. And the disciples were exemplary in that. And there may have been hidden teachings that were lost or suppressed. People do assume that too. But even so, to those simple men, probably illiterate, he had to speak in parables, and to the people he spoke in these wonderful teaching stories, which are like the Sufi teaching stories, and the Middle East teaching stories were classic, because you do speak to a population that doesn't have the literate education level. And that's why St. Paul is so different, because he was an educated man. He spoke Greek and Aramaic and probably Latin. And he spoke on a totally different level, and he gets to a very different theological level. He brings in, all these theological points, the Trinity and all that, and the divinity of Christ. And that's where you get more of the theology, is from St. Paul. But you get the love feeling from the disciples that actually live with Jesus. So you see so much in the Gospels. When you know Baba, you go back and read those Gospels. It's fascinating because you feel Baba there, and you feel what's sort of left out or hinted at as the way he may have dealt with people. Compare it to what we have of Baba. Well, I guess that's enough for this evening. Sorry I can't be there to answer questions in the live audience. So, Jai Baba again.